Every morning at 9, former U.S. Representative David Jolly would walk into a windowless room 2 blocks away from the Capitol building. He wasn't there to draft legislation or meet with constituents. He was there for what the party called call time. He'd pick up a phone and start dialing, working his way through a list of potential donors. The officials who ran the call center had given him his daily quota. He had to raise $18,000, not for the month, not for the week, but by the end of that day. This single task would dominate his schedule for 30 hours every week, leaving him with just about 2 hours a day to do the actual job voters had elected him to do. This isn't an anomaly. This is American democracy's best-kept open secret, the invisible contest that decides who gets to run for office long before you ever get a chance to vote for them. Wow. That story is not just, one person's experience. It really paints a picture of how American politics actually works day to day. That quota, $18,000 a day in 30 hours, just dialing for dollars.
It really crystallizes it, doesn't it? That's the wealth primary in action. It's this invisible hurdle, this contest that happens way before any primary election you see on a ballot.
That basically decides who's even viable, who gets party backing, who gets to be a candidate, people like you, the listener, even get to consider.
Exactly. It's the gatekeeper. And honestly, if you want the core issue facing U.S. governance today, this is probably it. So today, we're going deep on this. We'll break down the mechanics, how this wealth thing excludes people, especially non-affluent candidates.
Right.
And crucially, we want to look at the real-world policy consequences. What does the system actually cost the average person? And then we'll pivot. We'll look at solutions, compare the U.S. way to what other countries do, places that use public financing and spending limits to try and make things fairer.
That's a great roadmap, because you, listening, need to get the choices you see on Election Day. They're the result of this financial winnowing process that's already happened behind the scenes. So let's dive into that first part, this exclusionary mechanism, starting with just how incredibly expensive it is to even think about running.
Well, yeah, the sheer cost of running for federal office today it's just out of reach for most ordinary people. The big turning point was probably the Supreme Court's Buckley v. Valeo decision back in '76.
That's the one that opened the floodgates for spending.
Pretty much. It essentially said independent spending couldn't be limited, equating it with speech. And what happened in the next, 17 years? Election costs just exploded.
How much are we talking?
By 1992, overall campaign spending had shot up by nearly 700%. Over $678 million spent just on federal campaigns that year. 700%.
Wow. In less than 2 decades. So the barrier isn't about having good ideas or connecting with voters anymore, is it? It's about being a fundraising machine.
That's exactly right. The wealth primary isn't just some side issue. Many observers say it's now the decisive part of the whole process.
The main event, almost.
Yeah. The prevailing view is basically that the champion money raiser wins almost regardless of the merits, their policies, their experience. None of that matters as much as bringing in the cash. It's less like applying for a public service role and more like, auditioning to be chief fundraiser.
Which means the whole system becomes this kind of economic gauntlet. It systematically weeds out anyone who doesn't already have money or, connections to people with money.
And that's where you really see the human cost, the people we lose. Think about someone like Marcus, you mentioned him earlier, a former firefighter, served on his local council. The kind of person voters often say they want, right? Deep community roots, practical experience.
Exactly. The ideal candidate on paper.
So he decides to run for Congress. But what happens? He finds out pretty quickly that his background, his service, it's all secondary to whether he can spend hours dialing for dollars.
So instead of town halls in his district in Pennsylvania, he's stuck in a call center.
6 to 8 hours a day, yeah. Calling wealthy folks, often people completely outside his district, New York, California, wherever the money is. He's basically being told to chase donors who have zero stake in the community he wants to represent.
Yeah, it must be incredibly demoralizing.
Immense psychological toll. He's performing for the party machine, not connecting with voters. And eventually the system demands this relentless financial grind. And, when he just couldn't keep up the exhaustion, the disillusionment, he had to drop out. A potentially great candidate lost simply because the entry fee was too high.
And this filtering out of good, but maybe less wealthy, candidates limits the choices for all of us. It also seems constitutionally weird, doesn't it? I mean, didn't the Supreme Court say states can't use wealth to decide if a candidate is serious?
Yeah, that's the precedent from Bullock v. Carter in 1972. Texas had these incredibly high filing fees, up to almost $9,000 back then, just to get on the ballot. The court struck them down because they excluded poor but serious candidates. The ruling basically said you can't make access to the ballot depend on someone's bank account.
Okay, so the courts say you can't use a high filing fee as a wealth test. But now we have this wealth primary that implicitly demands candidates raise, what was it, $18,000 a day? That seems like a much, much higher wealth test, just imposed differently.
It really does create this paradox, this sort of catch-22. The official rules say no wealth test, but the practical reality of fundraising imposes an exponentially higher one. And even if a challenger somehow scrapes past that,
They hit another wall.
they hit the incumbent wall of money. Incumbents have this massive double advantage, both public and private funding, that makes them incredibly hard to beat.
Okay, let's break that down. The public subsidies first. You're saying taxpayer money is effectively boosting incumbents' re-election campaigns.
Well, yes, that's basically what happens. There's a conservative estimate putting the public self-subsidy for a member of Congress at around $200,000 over 2 years.
$200,000, where does that come from?
It's things like taxpayer-paid staff doing work that's very close to campaigning, subsidized travel, office space. But the really big visible one is the franking privilege.
Ah, the free mail, where they use their signature instead of a stamp.
That's supposed to be for official communication, right? Informing constituents.
That's the justification. But in practice, it's routinely used as taxpayer-funded campaign literature, especially right before an election. They send out these mass mailings talking about all their great work, constituent services, policy wins.
Free advertising, basically.
Exactly. High-volume advertising that a challenger has absolutely no hope of matching financially. And the scale is pretty shocking when you look at the numbers.
How bad is it?
Get this. Between 1991 and 1992, three-quarters, 75% of House members spent more on their free franking mail in that one election cycle than the average challenger spent on their entire campaign.
Wow. So the incumbent is using public funds for postage and printing, while the challenger is killing themselves raising $18,000 a day just to maybe afford a mailer. That's the reality. And that public advantage just reinforces the private money advantage they already have.
Right. The private funding tilt. How big is that gap?
It's huge. On average, incumbents have about a 3-to-1 private money advantage over challengers. But even that average hides some extremes. Back in 1992 again, House incumbents outspent their challengers by an average of $403,000.
$400,000 more on average.
And think about where that money comes from. They raised more than 8 times the amount of money from political action committees, PCs, compared to challengers.
Why PACEs?
Because PACEs usually represent established interests, industries, unions, whatever. And who do they want to back? The person already in office, the one who's positioned to actually deliver the policies they want. They overwhelmingly bet on the incumbent.
Okay, so let's tally this up. The incumbent gets taxpayer-funded mail and staff help. They've got name recognition. And they have 3 times the private funding, heavily fueled by PACE. What does this actually mean for elections? Are they even competitive?
Increasingly, no. The system pretty much guarantees stability. Or maybe stagnation is a better word. There's a group called Common Cause that defines non-competitive races pretty clearly.
How do they define it?
A race is non-competitive if the incumbent is either completely unopposed, financially unopposed, meaning the challenger raised less than $25,000 total.
$25,000. That's nothing in a congressional race.
Exactly. Or financially non-competitive, meaning the challenger raised less than half of what the incumbent did. Using that definition, in the 1992 general election, a staggering 82% of House incumbents had one of those massive advantages.
82%. And the killer statistic.
Every single one of those incumbents won. All of them. If you have that kind of financial wall protecting you, you are basically guaranteed re-election. It ensures self-perpetuation.
So when 8 out of 10 races are essentially decided before they even start because of money, it changes who representatives feel accountable to, right? It's not the average voter anymore.
It shifts entirely. They become accountable to the donor class, the small slice of the population that funds their political survival. And this is where we see the real policy cost, the cost that impacts you, the listener, directly.
Let's get specific about that concentration of influence. Where does the money actually come from?
Well, it's definitely not coming evenly from everyone. It's a tiny, wealthy fraction of the population. Get this. Fewer than 1 out of every 100 citizens specifically, those who give $200 or more, provide almost 80%, 77% to be precise, of all the campaign money in federal elections.
Less than 1% of people providing almost 80% of the funds. That is extreme concentration. If you're a politician, that tiny group holds immense power over your career.
Their priorities inevitably become your priorities, and the demographics make it even clearer. If you look at income, citizens earning over $125,000 a year, that's only about 2.7% of the population, they are 10 times more likely to donate than people making under $15,000.
10 times more likely.
And it gets even more concentrated at the very, very top. Just 12 megadonors, 12 individuals, contributed an unbelievable $3.4 billion between 2009 and 2020. That accounted for 1 out of every $13 spent in federal politics during that time.
$3.4 billion from just 12 people. That's not just funding campaigns. That's funding entire political infrastructures, think tanks, media outlets.
Absolutely. It shapes the entire landscape. And we're seeing this play out dramatically right now. You mentioned Timothy Mellon, the timber heir.
Yeah, the number was huge.
He alone gave $165 million in 2024 just to influence the presidential race. One person. That amount of money dwarfs the cost of major policy programs, let alone funding multiple Senate campaigns. When a politician knows that one conversation with one person could potentially solve their fundraising problems for months, well, their focus naturally shifts.
And adding another layer to this, a lot of this big money is deliberately hidden from public view through dark money groups.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Dark money is a huge problem. It flows through these nonprofit groups, usually 501c4s, which don't have to disclose their donors.
How does that work? Aren't they supposed to be social welfare groups?
Technically, yes. Their primary purpose is supposed to be social welfare, but there are loopholes that allow them to spend heavily on politics as long as it's not their primary activity. It allows billionaires to pour in cash completely anonymously. And dark money spending hit a record $1.9 billion in 2024.
Almost $2 billion flowing into elections with no transparency about the source. It creates this opaque system where influence is hidden and accountability just disappears.
It's the perfect way to obscure influence. You have these complex networks of groups, often tied to specific ideologies or industries, making it almost impossible for you, the voter, to follow the money from the donor to the political outcome.
And this hidden influence translates directly into actual laws and policies, doesn't it? Often things the public really doesn't want.
Oh, absolutely. The policy cost is undeniable. It's measured in things like subsidies for favorite industries or the failure to pass popular reforms.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Give us a couple of clear examples. How about the fossil fuel industry?
Perfect example. Look at the numbers for the 2024 cycle. Fossil fuel companies invested about $219 million in elections. About 88% of that went to Republicans.
Okay, $219 million invested. What was the return on that investment?
They receive an estimated $20 billion with a B in federal subsidies every year.
$20 billion a year in subsidies for a $219 million investment.
It's an incredible return, nearly 100 to 1. And this happens despite widespread public concern about climate change. The policy isn't driven by public good, it's driven by the industry's ability to fund campaigns.
Okay, another big one. The financial industry. Wall Street.
Always a major player. They spent around $2.9 billion in the 2019-20 election cycle alone, and we saw the direct impact of that spending in 2018.
What happened then?
There was a key vote on weakening parts of the Dodd-Frank Act. You know, the regulations put in place after the 2008 financial crisis to prevent another meltdown.
Right.
3 Democratic senators who were seen as politically vulnerable and had each received over $250,000 from the financial industry broke ranks. They joined Republicans to vote for the rollback.
So the money they received from the industry seemed to outweigh party loyalty, or arguably the public interest in stronger financial oversight.
It certainly looks that way. And this brings us back to people like Elena, the retired teacher you mentioned, struggling with prescription drug costs. Her situation really highlights this policy gap.
How so?
Well, you have overwhelming public support for policies like allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices. Something like 82% of Americans support that. And around 80% believe donors have way too much influence. Clear public mandate, right?
Seems pretty clear.
Yet Congress hasn't passed any really significant campaign finance reform since way back in 2002. That gap between public will and policy reality, that's the ultimate cost of the wealth primary.
The system seems captured.
Functionally captured, yes. It leads observers like Lawrence Lessig to call it a banana republic democracy, where this tiny, super wealthy elite effectively controls the funding, and therefore they control the political agenda.
So if the U.S. system is structurally tilted away from the average voter because of this wealth primary, we really need to look elsewhere for solutions. How do other comparable democracies handle this? Do they have the same problems?
Well, first off, just comparing the sheer cost is eye-opening. We talked about the U.S. 2024 cycle maybe exceeding $20 billion. Now, compare that to, say, the UK's last general election in 2019. Total spending was around 147 million.
Which is what, under 200 million US?
Roughly, yeah. Or look at Germany. Their federal elections typically cost less than 100 million. The U.S. spends orders of magnitude more.
Why? Is it just a bigger country?
Size is part of it, but the fundamental difference is that we allow private wealth, especially this really concentrated wealth, to dominate political spending in a way most other established democracies simply don't.
So it's not that they don't value political speech, they just draw the line differently to protect the process itself.
Exactly. They put structural reforms in place, often decades ago, to make sure that where the money comes from doesn't completely dictate the political outcome. You mentioned the American student whose friend was studying in Norway.
Right. Noticed a totally different political atmosphere.
Yeah, no constant barrage of fundraising pleas and attack ads. Campaigns were shorter, focused on policy, and the candidates seemed more like, well, normal people, not just millionaires or executives.
So what are the specific mechanisms these countries use? What did Norway do?
Norway started using public financing way back in 1970. Now, public funds cover about 74%, almost three-quarters of political party funding there. That massively reduces their dependence on private donors.
Okay, and Canada?
Canada went even further after reforms around 2003. They banned corporate donations entirely, and they put pretty strict limits on how much individuals can contribute.
And then there's France. You said there's really good data on the French system.
Yes, France is a fascinating case study because of reforms they made back in 1988. For their departmental elections, sort of like county level, they introduced two key things: strict spending limits and reimbursement of campaign costs.
Reimbursement, how does that work?
If a candidate gets at least 5% of the vote, the state reimburses up to 50% of their documented campaign expenses. And we can actually measure the impact of this using a clever research method called regression discontinuity design, or RDD.
Okay, RDD. Break that down for us. What does it let researchers do?
Basically, RDD takes advantage of a sharp cutoff point. In France, these campaign finance rules, the spending limits, and the reimbursement they kicked in precisely when a district's population hit 9,000 inhabitants.
So districts just under 9,000 had the old rules, and districts just over 9,000 had the new rules.
Exactly. And because districts right around that 9,000 mark are likely very similar in other ways, you can compare the election outcomes just above and just below the threshold. It isolates the effect of the finance laws almost like a natural experiment.
Clever. So what did this RDD study find? Did the spending limits work? Did the reimbursement work? Which mattered more?
This is the really key finding. The positive effects were driven primarily by the reimbursement part, not the spending limits on their own.
Really? So giving money back was more important than capping spending?
It seems so. The reimbursement provided a crucial financial floor. It lowered the risk and offset the high costs of running a serious campaign, making it possible for candidates without personal wealth or big donor networks to compete viably.
That's a huge lesson for the U.S. potentially. The state helping cover costs if you prove you're a serious contender, that's what makes the difference. What was the impact on competition in France?
It significantly boosted competition. Because the financial risk was lower, it specifically helped runner-up candidates and brand new candidates, the types who usually struggle the most to raise private money. The public funds helped level the playing field.
And what about incumbents? We talked about that wall of money here, the 82% re-election rate for financially dominant incumbents. Did the French rules affect incumbents?
Dramatically. Incumbents became less likely to win re-election in the districts with the new rules. But maybe even more interestingly, the rules acted as a deterrent. Incumbents were also less likely to even run again.
Why?
Presumably because their built-in advantage from private fundraising was significantly undercut by the reimbursement system. It broke that cycle of near automatic re-election for the person already in power.
That's fascinating. Did it have any effect on the political leaning of who won?
It did, actually. The study found the rules increased the probability of left-wing candidates winning by about 8.5 percentage points.
Why would that be?
Well, it aligns with what we generally see. Left-wing candidates, on average, tend to receive fewer large private donations compared to right-wing candidates. So when the system relies less on private money and more on this public floor, those candidates benefit disproportionately. It arguably shifts policy closer to the median voter.
And did the reimbursement affect whether candidates tried again after losing?
Yes, that was another important finding. Candidates who got over that 5% threshold needed for reimbursement were 4.2 percentage points more likely to run in the next election.
Because they weren't broke from the first attempt.
Exactly. They got a significant chunk of their money back. Losing wasn't financially devastating. This encourages good candidates to stay engaged, to run again, rather than being scared off permanently by the crippling cost of a failed campaign.
Now, you mentioned a caveat. These rules didn't seem to work as well in French municipal elections.
That's right. In those elections, they use a different system, a proportional list system, where candidates can pool resources across the entire list. Also, overall spending was just generally higher in those races.
So the reimbursement didn't have the same punch.
It seems the public reimbursement had less of a marginal impact in that context. But for the single-member departmental races, the evidence is pretty clear. Public reimbursement was highly effective at disrupting the wealth primary and boosting competition.
Okay, so these international examples, especially France, show that public funding, particularly reimbursement, can work. It makes elections more competitive and less dependent on private wealth. But that brings us right back to the U.S. problem, the legal constitutional roadblocks.
Right. The success stories elsewhere just highlight the American dilemma. The main barriers here are these major Supreme Court decisions, primarily Buckley v. Vallejo and later Citizens United.
These are the rulings that equate spending money in politics with free speech under the First Amendment.
Precisely. The core logic in Buckley was that in our modern society, communicating effectively, especially to a mass audience, requires spending money. So the court reasoned, limiting how much you can spend directly limits how much you can speak.
And they specifically rejected the idea of trying to level the playing field.
Yeah, they did. The court explicitly said that the concept of restricting the speech of some people, the wealthy spenders, in order to enhance the relative voice of others, the non-wealthy, was, and I quote, wholly foreign to the First Amendment. They rejected an equality rationale for spending limits.
And Buckley didn't just state a principle. It struck down actual laws, didn't it?
Yes, it invalidated several key types of limits. Overall limits on how much a campaign could spend, limits on how much candidates could spend of their own money, and limits on independent expenditures by outside groups or individuals. Citizens United later doubled down on protecting independent spending by corporations and unions. Together, they create this very strong constitutional protection for spending money in politics.
So if directly limiting spending is basically off the table legally, reformers have to find another way in, constitutionally speaking.
That's the challenge. If you can't lower the ceiling for the wealthy, maybe you can raise the floor for everyone else. This leads to arguments based on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
How does equal protection apply here?
The argument draws on the spirit of that Bullock v. Carter case about filing fees. If the state can't explicitly use wealth to determine who's a serious candidate, then maybe a campaign finance system that systematically disadvantages non-affluent citizens as a group, effectively denying them meaningful participation, violates equal protection.
So the current system acts like a de facto wealth test, even if it's not explicit.
That's the argument. It excludes based on economic status. So the proposed solution has to work within the Buckley framework. It can't limit spending. Instead, it focuses on creating a system of adequate public financing.
Like the French reimbursement model.
Exactly. Or perhaps a system of matching small dollar donations with public funds. The goal is to provide a baseline level of funding for all serious candidates, including those without personal wealth or rich connections.
This is the raise the floor, don't lower the ceiling idea.
Precisely. You don't restrict the wealthy candidate's spending, which the court protects as speech. Instead, you use public funds to bring poor candidates up, giving them the resources they need to get their message out and actually compete. It shifts the focus from trying to equalize outcomes, which the court rejected, to ensuring adequate access and opportunity to participate.
Okay, that's one approach. But you mentioned another, maybe more novel legal strategy involving a different part of the First Amendment, the petition clause?
Yes, this is a really interesting, though less tested, line of argument. It basically pits one part of the First Amendment against another.
Free speech versus the right to petition.
Exactly. The petition clause guarantees the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The argument goes like this. If the massive, unlimited spending by wealthy donors and corporations, which is currently protected as speech, creates so much noise and exerts so much pressure,
that it effectively drowns out the voices and concerns of average citizens.
right. If it tramples the average citizen's ability to have their petition, their plea, their grievance meaningfully heard and considered by the government, then you have a clash between two constitutional rights. And when rights clash, one might have to give way.
So the sheer volume of money isn't just speech, it's potentially blocking another fundamental right, the right to be heard by your government.
That's the core idea. The right to petition isn't just about sending a letter. It implies a right to have your concerns considered on their merits without being overwhelmed by the influence that comes with massive spending. Think back to David Jolly spending 30 hours a week dialing for dollars.
Yeah.
If politicians are structurally forced to prioritize the demands tied to huge donations over the needs of their constituents just to stay politically viable, then maybe the system itself is violating the petition clause rights of those constituents.
So using the petition clause could offer a different angle to challenge the current system, one that focuses less on restricting speech and more on protecting representation and access.
That's the hope. It asks the courts to recognize that unlimited spending doesn't just enable more speech. It can also inflict a real harm by degrading the political power and the right to be heard of citizens without wealth. It's an attempt to argue that at some point, overwhelming financial influence stops being just expression and becomes, effectively, a form of structural silencing.
So, wrapping this all up, we started this deep dive looking at the intense pressure on someone like David Jolly, that $18,000 daily quota. It showed how the system is built around fundraising, giving incumbents huge advantages, and basically freezing out potential candidates who aren't wealthy or connected.
And we trace that directly to policy outcomes, things like massive fossil fuel subsidies persisting despite climate change, or the failure to pass popular measures like Medicare drug price negotiation, or the weakening of financial regulations. These aren't random. They often track closely with where the big money is coming from.
But then we looked overseas at countries like France, Norway, Canada, and we saw clear evidence, especially from the French system.
Right. The RDD study showing that public financing, particularly reimbursement, genuinely works. It makes elections more competitive, it weakens the stranglehold of incumbents, and it helps good candidates stay in the political process even if they lose once. Providing that financial floor seems to be key.
Which leads the U.S. facing a pretty stark choice based on everything we've discussed. We either continue with a system where, let's be honest, a tiny fraction of wealthy donors holds disproportionate power over who runs, who wins, and what laws get passed.
A system that, as some argue, looks less like a representative democracy and more like, well, that banana republic democracy where wealth dictates policy.
Or we find a way, perhaps through these equal protection or petition clause arguments, perhaps through constitutional amendment eventually, to adopt the kinds of solutions that other democracies have successfully used for decades: public financing. Maybe spending limits if the legal landscape changes to ensure elections are more about ideas and qualifications than just deep pockets.
Ultimately, it comes down to this fundamental conflict. Is the unlimited spending of private wealth in politics an untouchable form of free speech, as the courts have largely held, or does the principle that your wealth shouldn't determine your political voice or your government's responsiveness to you take precedence in a functioning democracy? That's the core tension we're grappling with.